Good day and welcome to this video podcast on the introduction to the flipped classroom design. This is Dr. Stuart Ingalls. The purpose of this podcast is to give you an orientation and overview of what a flipped classroom is and how it is specifically going to be implemented within the first unit of the gross anatomy class that you will be beginning to take in August of this year. The objectives for this podcast, first of all, be providing you with an overview of the concept of a flipped classroom and how it can be implemented in a variety of different situations. I'm then going to outline the perceived advantages of a flipped classroom specifically for teaching the clinical gross anatomy course that you will be taking. Next, we'll be providing specific instructions on using the video podcasts in conjunction with the PowerPoint notes that will be provided to you throughout the different classroom settings. Finally, we're going to be introducing you to the concept of a facilitated active learning session, or a FAL session. This is specifically a term that we have come up with ourselves to describe the specific in-class sessions that we'll be conducting in conjunction with the video podcasts. Before we identify what an actual flipped classroom is, we'll take a few minutes to look at what the quote-unquote traditional lecture looks like. The word lecture itself is a French word meaning reading, which when you look at traditional lectures is not too far from the truth. In the image on the right, we have what can be considered a typical lecture session, very similar to what you've probably experienced in your own undergrad. At the center of the room, we have the professor, who is reading from his set of notes and providing information to the audience itself, which is the student body. Now, if we look specifically at the information being provided, it tends to be a unidirectional flow of information. What this means is that the instructor is disseminating information out to the students, but there's really not the opportunity for the students to interact and communicate back. Now, you can probably remember when you went to undergrad that there were some students that would stop the professor and would ask poignant questions. Well, here's the situation. First of all, a lot of these questions are not going to relate to the majority of your classmates, and so consequently, over time, if you do this on a regular basis, they end up getting a little bit upset with you. Second problem. When a professor plans a lecture, he usually goes with the assumption that he will be uninterrupted the entire time and tries to pack as much information as possible into those 50 minutes. So consequently, when a student interjects and asks questions or asks him to repeat concepts, he starts to become concerned as to whether he'll be able to get through all the information in time, and so consequently he also ends up becoming frustrated with this student. So consequently, the lecture is really not the place for interaction back and forth between professors and students. The idea is the professor talks and the student listens and writes down what the professor has to say. Here's the other problem with this. As I said, this professor is probably packing as much as humanly possible within those 50 minutes. So consequently, the information is coming at the students so fast and furious that they don't really have time to digest and think about what is being said, because if they do, then they miss the next point that is being made, and they really don't have a chance to record down this information. So the majority of class time for the student is spent frantically writing down as much as they possibly can related to what the professor is saying, and if they don't quite understand it at that point in time, oh well, so be it. The idea is they'll take that information home with them, they'll review the notes in their own personal time, and try to make sense of them at a point in time when the professor is not at all available to them for extra help. So this is the record, but don't process sort of mentality that goes along with a lot of traditional lectures. So the question becomes, where did all this come from? And in the last little bit, I've been actually looking into the history of anatomical teaching and anatomical dissection for some lectures I do with other groups on campus, and came across this image that was taken from a 1300 dissection class. So here we have the professor sitting on top of a podium, reading from a text, and we have the students below actually interacting and working, in this case with the body, so they're not actually taking notes. Now, as I was going through this and also working on the curriculum reform that we've been doing and looking at different methods for teaching and instruction, I sort of had this revelation. Now, if you look at the situation, obviously a lot of things have changed between then and now, in particular the clothing, but when you really get down to it, on the surface of the instructional method, it's really not any different. You have a professor here with a collection of notes disseminating information to the students and the students listening to what the professor has to say. Now in the 1300s this made complete sense. Remember, this predates the printing press. Textbooks were not made wide-scale available because they were so difficult to produce on a regular basis. For a given subject, a university would be lucky to have 3 or 4 books related to that subject matter, and they were always exclusively held by the professors. I mean, let's face it, who would trust an undergraduate student with a textbook? They're just going to spill coffee or whatever they were drinking back then on it. So basically the textbook stayed in the professor's hands. If the students wanted a transcription of what was in the textbooks, at least what the professor thought was important related to the textbooks, they would have to bring quill and parchment to class and write all that information down. Consequently, this was the most effective way of disseminating knowledge among the masses. It was really the only way that you could possibly do it, and so back in the 1300s, this was an incredibly effective teaching method. Fast forward to the 1800s, and we see a lecture being given by Michael Faraday here. But once again, not a lot has changed. We have a professor situated at the front of the class, which is talking about some chemical experiments that he's doing in front of an audience. And well, in this case, they're not really writing anything down. I think this is distinguished individuals, but if this was a typical classroom setting, then you can bet that there's individuals with quills and parchment out trying to record everything possible that Michael Faraday has to say. So this method is deeply, deeply rooted in tradition, and you can understand the purpose of this method for several hundred years, even going back to the ancient Greek times. We're talking about several thousand years in this situation. Look at the world today, though, and even look at the world and how it's changed over the past 20 years, because there's been a lot of change. A lot of change. Let me try to put this into perspective for you.
Mozart's Ghost, the hottest band on the internet.
Yeah, that was a movie called The Net, which was originally filmed in 1995. That's 19 years ago. That was when I was a senior in high school, and I remember seeing that movie in theaters and being in awe with the computer technology that they were using. So feel free to have a laugh at my expense right now. There's another scene from a movie where she's sitting on the beach and just wishing that she had access to a modem. I don't even know if you guys know what modems were back in the day. So, point being, we've seen a lot of drastic changes, and it's time to really start asking the question, with all the changes that we've seen in our technology and in our society, is the traditional method the most efficient any longer? This is where we get into the concept of a flipped classroom design. To help you understand, I have a couple of additional YouTube videos for you to check out. The first one is a documentary from 60 Minutes, which introduces an individual named Sal Khan. He was the individual that founded the Khan Academy, and he's the first one that really started to set off the concept of a flipped classroom, and it discusses it here. The video starts partway in where it actually picks up and discusses the flipped classroom, but if you want, and I would encourage it, it's a 13-minute segment. Sal Khan was just a generally interesting person, so if you do have the time, you might be interested in hearing his story and how he went from tutoring his cousin online to receiving million-dollar grants from Bill Gates. The second video does a very eloquent job of actually describing what a flipped classroom actually is and its practical sense. So it's only a 3-minute video, but it gives you a really nice synopsis of the overall intent and core of a flipped classroom. So hopefully you took a few minutes to look at those videos and now have a basic understanding of what a flipped classroom is. Now we're going to look specifically at Unit 1 of Anatomy to show how we're going to apply the flipped classroom to our own studies. First of all, the lectures are going to be presented as pre-recorded video podcasts. These are going to be released, including the instructor's notes, the PowerPoint presentation, and any additional resources which will be used throughout the video podcast. Students will be able to download these to their computers and will be able to watch them at their own leisure. The idea is for the students to view the podcast prior to coming into class itself. So this actually takes place of the time that you would typically spend outside of the class reviewing your notes. It's important to emphasize that I'm not trying to increase the workload for this course. What I'm trying to do is provide you an opportunity to study the material inside of the classroom itself when I'm available to give you some assistance. And the lecture portion, which really just requires you to sit back and listen to an instructor teach, that's something that you're going to now be able to do on your own free time when it's most convenient for you. For the class itself, students will arrive having already watched these videos and ready to participate in what we call the Facilitated Active Learning Sessions, FAL. We'll talk about a little bit more about these as we go along. This will involve a clinical application of the anatomical knowledge. It'll also allow individuals to work through problems as a group and call upon each other's abilities and understandings to be able to educate one another. The important thing with the Facilitated Active Learning session is that my role changes. Now, rather than spending the entire time talking and the entire time having you listen and have it be that unidirectional flow of information, it's actually going to be bi-directional. Really, I'm just there as a facilitator. I'll be walking around through the various groups. If groups are getting stuck, they would raise their hand, call me over. I'd give some additional guidance and instruction. But really, the point of me being there is to help you as the student to be able to come to the conclusion on your own. Rather than just give you the information, it's really requiring you to think about the information. And really, this is the assimilation phase where you're going to be able to take the basic understanding of anatomy and apply it to these clinical situations, which are going to help you for your tests in the course, your qualification exams, and which are going to help you in your field of practice after you've graduated. To demonstrate the advantages of a flipped classroom design, let's consider a hypothetical situation. Here we have 4 separate students attending a traditional didactic lecture. On the far left, we have Lori. Lori is presently bored out of her skull. She took the same class as an undergrad with an exceptional professor who explained everything clearly in intricate detail. She has a strong mastery of the material, but still attends classes because occasionally the professor will emphasize a point not covered in her undergrad class. Mostly, however, she is able to anticipate everything the professor says and wishes he would go at a quicker pace. To Lori's right is Allie. Unlike Lori, Allie has never taken the course before and struggles with the concepts. She tries to keep up with the pace of the lecture, but it always seems that at about 20 minutes in, she gets hung up on a key concept and loses track on what the professor is saying. By the time the class ends, she feels bogged down and will need to spend several hours working out the material on her own. When the course started, Lori tried to help Allie out by explaining confusing concepts, but neither were able to keep up with the professor, and students around them kept shooting them dirty looks because of the distraction this created. Next, we have Whitney. Whitney seems relaxed and fully engaged, focusing intently on her computer screen. That is because Whitney is presently checking her Facebook account and hasn't taken in a word the professor has said for the last 10 minutes. Whitney has, however, finished reading an article about 10 celebrities who are notoriously bad tippers and will very soon like her BFF's status update about the killer creme brulee she had at the new coffee shop that opened. Jenna's not even attempting to hide her disinterest. She finds the seats in the lecture hall uncomfortable and can't sit up straight for long periods of time without her back hurting. To make matters worse, Jenna has a notoriously short attention span and the class takes place in mid-afternoon, at a time when Jenna always tends to feel tired. 20 minutes in, and Jenna is typically fast asleep with her head on the desk. So how does all this change with the flipped classroom design? Remember, the lectures are now available as video podcasts off the D2L site. Students can access the site through their university account and download the podcast to their computer as AVI video files. Once downloaded, it is theirs to access at any time. This means that students can view the lecture material whenever and wherever they choose. Rather than having students come to the lecture at a set time and location, the lecture comes to the students at a time and place that the student finds most convenient. Students can view lectures from the comfort of their own homes, sitting in their favorite chair in their pajamas if they so choose. And when I say wherever they choose, I mean it. Advanced video editing software allows for conversion of the files into literally dozens of platforms, which makes it possible to format the videos to be viewed on iPhones, BlackBerry, and Android devices, which means that you have access to the videos anywhere you take your cell phone. You can be at the Wellness Center on a stair climber watching the podcast for the class session that afternoon if you so choose. Another big advantage is the ability to pause the recording whenever you wish to take a break. Think back to undergraduate lectures and the number of times you had to hold it in because you didn't want to get up in the middle of a lecture for a bathroom break, or the number of times you found yourself losing focus or dozing off and missing out on what the professor was saying. It's natural. It's difficult for anyone to maintain focus for a solid 50 minutes. With a video podcast, you can pause the recording at any time. Get up, use the bathroom, answer the phone, make a snack, and so forth. And when you're ready to come back to it, you can pick up right from where you left off without missing a beat. The other big advantage is the ability for each student to view the material at their own pace. As described in the previous video, everyone learns at a different pace, and in a single lecture there will always be individuals that find the pace to be too slow and those that find the pace to be too fast. With a video podcast, each student sets the pace for themselves. Students who are already familiar with the material can adjust the speed of the playback to watch the video in a fraction of the time, just to be sure that there aren't any surprises. Students unfamiliar with the material can pause the video to reflect on what was just said without worrying about missing the next point. This affords time to consult a textbook, surf the net, or send emails to students or professors for clarification of confusing concepts. Moreover, with a single mouse click, the student can backtrack and re-watch segments if they were unsure of what was said. Remember I spoke off the top about the problems with asking questions during a lecture or asking a professor to repeat what was just said? No longer an issue. True, it means that the average time spent listening to a lecture from start to finish may increase substantially, but the bottom line is that, rather than recording but not processing the information provided in the lecture, the student is able to record and process the information at the same time. Considering the amount of time spent going back over notes and trying to tie it into the PowerPoint slides, trying to remember exactly what it was the professor was saying, the overall process, lecture combined with simulation of knowledge, is much more efficient in the long run. Let's check in with our 4 students to see how they're doing with the video podcasts. Here we see Lori, taking it a bit easy, having a snack, and tweeting about it. This is because Lori decided to race through the lecture at 1.5 speed and is now taking a break. She finds she is able to stay on top of the material just fine at the faster speed and pauses the video on the rare occasions that the professor mentions a new concept so that she can write it down. Overall, though, she enjoys getting through the material in quicker time. Allie's still working away on the material. She usually takes twice the allotted time to finish watching the lectures, but that is because she is constantly pausing and taking careful notes on what is being said. She will also frequently skip back and re-watch short segments to help her understand what the professor is talking about. It requires a greater time commitment, but by moving at her own pace, Allie has a much stronger understanding of the lecture material and was able to follow along with everything the professor was saying. Allie's working alone tonight, but more often than not, she and Lori will do the lectures together. They pause frequently as Lori explains important concepts in more detail and Allie asks specific questions about the content. They typically study at Allie's place where they can talk at normal volume without bothering anyone. And because they are able to pause the lecture, they don't miss out on anything being presented. Allie is grateful to get assistance from somebody who understands the material as well as Lori does, and Lori enjoys explaining the concepts, finding that it helps her to understand it at a deeper level, having to explain it to somebody else. Here's Jenna again. Jenna's at home, sitting back on her couch in her comfortable study sweats, with a cup of coffee in her hands. Jenna's a bit of a night owl and finds that she's most productive in the evening, so that's when she decides to watch the videos. She finds she is able to focus longer, sitting back on her couch and in comfortable clothes. Having said that, Jenna still has a limited attention span, but will pause the video and get up and grab a snack or check her email anytime that she finds that her mind starts to wander. And Whitney? Well, Whitney's on the phone. She was watching the podcast, but saw a tweet from a close friend announcing that she had just got engaged. #OMG. Whitney picked up the phone and got through to her friend and is now hearing all the details about how it happened, where he had taken her, what she was wearing. You get the idea. The important point is that after she gets off the phone and the whirlwind of social media posts die down, Whitney will be able to return to the podcast and pick up right from where she left off. Next, we can look at the advantages of the actual classroom setting. Because the students have already watched the video lecture that contained all the pertinent information that the professor wanted the students to know, the classroom session can now be dedicated to the application of that knowledge. This typically takes a form of application questions presented to the class and the use of information presented in the podcast and PowerPoints to determine the correct answer. This is called active learning. The student is presented with a problem that requires solving and uses the available resources to come to an answer. The key difference from traditional didactic lectures is that the flow of information is now multi-directional. The professor will still impart some additional knowledge upon the students, but this constitutes only a fraction of the classroom time compared to being the exclusive focus in the traditional setting. There is now time for students to ask for clarification of ideas or to apply concepts to more abstract ideas, and importantly, this contributes to the educational experience of others rather than taking away from it. Moreover, the majority of questions are typically not even directed towards the professor. In most instances, students ask questions of one another in working towards the solutions to problems, with the professor hovering around, serving primarily as a facilitator. The result is a greater level of student engagement. As students are encouraged to contribute their own thoughts and ideas and experiences, there is constant switch between input and output and give and take of knowledge. As a result, students tend to be able to maintain their focus for longer periods of time without losing interest in the content matter. Also keep in mind that because of the important background information is provided in the podcasts, the professor has already successfully covered all the learning objectives for the day before the class even starts. This creates a much more relaxed learning environment in which the professor never has to worry about increasing his tempo to get through all the material he needs to cover, and the students never need to feel rushed. In general, the professor arrives to class with more application questions than the class will be likely to get through, with the number of questions covered being dictated by the pace and interest of the class. Even in the unlikely situation that the entire session is dedicated to the in-depth discussion of a single application question, everyone can leave satisfied that genuine learning took place and that no important concepts were left untaught. Let's return to our 4 students in the redesigned active learning classroom. With all the conversation and discussion happening around them, Allie and Lori feel much more comfortable discussing the material with one another. While the flow of knowledge heavily favors passing from Lori to Allie, there is a number of situations in which Allie has been able to contribute, either with her own understanding or challenging Lori with a question that really requires Lori to think. Right now, the discussion has become quite animated and has drawn Whitney's attention away from an important 20-question survey to determine which house she would belong to if she were a Game of Thrones character, to contribute her own knowledge of the material to the discussion. However, the group has reached a dead end with the discussion and are unsure of how to proceed. Jenna decides that it's time to call the professor over to clarify some confusion that the group members are experiencing and provide some guidance on how the discussion should proceed. Up to this point, we've been talking about the video podcasts and flipped classroom design in generalizations. It's time to look at the specifics as how this is going to relate to the actual anatomy class that you will be taking. To start with, what does the podcast look like? The answer to the question is you're watching one right now. The same technology that I use to put together the video podcast that you'll be watching throughout the term is being used to generate this orientation podcast, which you are presently viewing. This technology allows me to use such things as laser pointers to highlight important structures, and it also allows me to use pen capture technique to be able to draw specific images for the purpose of your understanding. Here I'm showing an excerpt from an actual video podcast that you will be looking at throughout the term. So again, you can see that the structures are populating in real time. I have muted the audio so that it doesn't create too much confusion hearing my voice and talking about 2 separate things. This specifically is showing what I call the kinesthetic learning exercises, KLE for short. This is an opportunity to take the skeletal structure, which you would be provided with and be able to print out as many copies as you so choose, and to be able to draw on the different structures as they're being talked about in real time as with myself. Now here's one of the beauties of the video podcast. Based on the reviews from the previous year, I did use this quite extensively in class, and I would say that about a third of the class thought it was wonderful and it really helped with their understanding of the anatomy. Another third of the class thought it was a complete waste of time for them. It didn't really add to their personal understanding of the material. And an additional third of the class really had no comment one way or the other. They could take or leave it. With the video podcast now, if this is something that is not really adding and assisting in your knowledge, it's something that you can skip over. When these videos are always done, I first talk about the structures and draw them in the kinesthetic learning exercise. Just jumping forward here a little bit. And then once the kinesthetic learning exercise is done, I use the images from Netter's Atlas, which you should all have access to, and I repeat all of the information again. So for those of you that really get a lot out of drawing these structures in and find that assists in your learning, though you're probably a very strong kinesthetic learner if that's the situation, then I would strongly recommend doing those exercises. If you're more of a visual learner or you've done a lot of this before, then the KLEs do take up a fair amount of time on the video podcasts, and you will find that if you are to skip over them, then the podcasts become much shorter in that situation. And there's absolutely no information that I talk about in the later sections where I identify the muscles using Netter that was talked about in the KLE. So it's all repetition, which means you can do the KLEs if you find them helpful, but if not, you can skip forward in the video and just bypass them. Here we have the PowerPoint presentation that actually accompanies the video you just took a look at. A couple of important notes to make here. First of all, you'll notice that the slide appears exactly as it showed up in the video. Secondly, you'll also notice that each video has a numbered section, but also, most importantly, a timestamp. This timestamp represents the period in the podcast itself that the slide is actually talked about. Remember, I just said that if there's certain aspects of the podcast presentation that you do not find helpful to yourself, you're able to skip over them. So if you get to this section of the podcast and decide that you don't want to participate in the kinesthetic learning exercise, jump forward to the next slide, look at the timestamp, and then just click on the video presentation until you're able to advance to the appropriate point in time. This allows you to navigate your way through the video, avoiding material you're not interested in looking at, and during review sessions for exams, being able to focus in on portions of the lecture that you wish to revisit. In short, I'm trying to do my very best to make this a user-friendly project, and if, as you're going through, you have some suggestions as to ways that it could be made even more easy to work with, I'm certainly interested in what you might have to say. Recognize that a number of you are Mac users and that sometimes PowerPoint can be temperamental. So for each PowerPoint presentation, there is also a PDF version, which is given the exact same file name. So it's really your preference as to which you decide to use. The PDF version is created from the PowerPoint using the Notes presentation page. So as you scroll through, you will notice that the bottom area typically includes a variety of different notes specific to the slide that you're looking at. These are also available in the PowerPoint section itself under the Notes section. You just have to toggle from Presentation View to be able to see it in the Notes View section. In addition, I plan to have all of the notes completely tabulated as one large Microsoft Word document for those that prefer to have a full set of notes in a single format. Again, just trying to give you all the different resources available to be able to take in the information. It's up to you to figure out what works best for your own learning needs. The fact of the matter is the podcasts themselves aren't even mandatory. If you find that listening to the podcast is just not the most effective way to learn, you can go to the textbook and read through the textbook. The information is all contained within there. There is nothing that I discuss in the podcast that isn't also discussed in the textbook. You can consult the Netter Atlas. You can consult different textbooks. You can consult online resources. What you have to be aware of, however, is that the podcasts are the most concise summary of what I consider to be the pertinent information and is probably going to be the most efficient means for preparing yourself for each of the facilitated active learning sessions. Speaking of facilitated active learning sessions, it's time to actually give you an idea of what these are related to. This is the term that we came up to describe the actual in-class component of this flipped classroom design. This is particularly a term that we've developed for ourselves. There was a bit of discussion about it. For those of you in the medical program, you'll be talking a lot about TBL sessions that you will be taking. Originally, this was called a modified TBL, but we thought that would just create too much confusion between the two, and so consequently it came up with its own name. Just as an aside, a few of the faculty members and myself joked around a little bit about calling this a facilitative, active, integrative learning session, just so that we could use the mnemonic FAIL for it, but we figured that the faculty would find this much more amusing than the student body. So we just went with facilitated active learning, or FAL session. This is what a facilitative active learning session is typically going to look like. This will consist of the 5-question multiple choice quiz that will occur at the beginning of each class session. This requires clicker technology for answering of these questions, and this is the component that will be graded. But keep in mind, we're only going to count the top 20 marks, so there's a lot of room for error, and if you have a particularly bad quiz, it shouldn't have an overall impact on your mark. What will happen is you will arrive promptly prior to 1 o'clock for each of these sessions, and by the time 1 o'clock rolls around, you're expected to be in your seats with your clickers handy. The quiz will then begin. You'll have roughly a minute per question, depending on the difficulty and the rate at which people answer, after which point all 5 questions will be tabulated and will be taken up. If there are any questions regarding the multiple choice quiz, you can ask it at this period of time to clarify any outstanding misconceptions. The next phase will involve a summary of the questions from the podcast or pre-readings. So in the evening prior, it's expected that you will be going through the podcast, or at least paying attention to the pre-readings. You're possibly going to come across some questions that you don't fully understand. Talk it over with your classmates, but importantly, I strongly encourage you to email me about these. I'm very good about checking my email in the evenings, particularly if I know that there's a podcast session that is being viewed, and I will do my very best to get back to you within the hour. More importantly, though, if I find that there are some interesting questions that are pertinent and would be valuable for the remainder of the class to hear, then during these summary sessions, I will put up some of the questions and provide my answer to them for the benefit of the entire class. Incidentally, if you feel a bit self-conscious about being called out in the middle of a class for a question that you submitted, you don't have to worry about this. When the questions are posted at the front, they're kept completely anonymous. I will never identify a student with this specific question, so you don't need to be concerned that asking a question means that your name is going to be put in the front of the class potentially the following day. Next phase is what we call the open floor question and answer period. So at this stage, if there are still any lingering questions that you might have related to the previous night's activity or any of the other material, or if you're curious about some sort of abstract application of the material from the previous night, this would be a good time to ask it. The next phase you'll notice is in light gray. This is because this is a bit of an optional one that is not always going to appear. It's a brief tutorial session that I might give. There will be occasions where I will be able to tie in some clinically relevant information, and it's most effectively done in a mini lecture format. For example, as we get towards the end of the upper limb, I plan to be given a brief tutorial session on clinical neuropathies and compartment syndromes related to the major nerves traveling within the upper limb. These are intended to be brief and to provide a succinct summary of what you might see. And again, you're only going to see these infrequently. They're not going to appear with each of the individual lectures. The important point with these sessions is the active learning.
The remaining activity is what's going to take the majority of the class time. This will be a series of clinical application questions related to the video podcast from the previous night in multiple choice format. Once again, this will require clicker technology, but unlike the 5 questions presented at the beginning of the class, this will not be at all graded, so there will be absolutely no effect, positive or negative, on the student's overall mark for right or wrong answers. Each question will be asked in a series of phases. First, the initial question will be put up and will require an individual response, typically lasting about 30 seconds. What this means is that each student will read over the question, look over the options, and answer the question independently of everyone else in the class. Similar to what you would do in a test situation. There's no consultation with anyone else. It's your own personal thoughts and your own personal ideas on the situation. After the 30 seconds are up, the distribution will be displayed. This means that the percentage of individuals that answered A, B, C, D, or E will be displayed on the screen. Note that at this stage, the correct answer will not be displayed. The question will then be repolled and will allow for group discussion. So with this phase of the exercise, students will be able to consult with those around them, discuss why they potentially came up with the different answers that they did. And during this 60-second phase, when a student is satisfied that they have made the correct decision, they will once again use their clickers to answer the question. At the end of this phase, the distribution will once again be displayed and compared to the previous distribution. And finally, the answer to the question will be displayed. So in the majority of cases, we will find a general consensus and we'll find that it is correct. But some interesting things happen sometimes. Occasionally, individuals will be swayed into one answer and it will be an incorrect answer. And in those situations, it obviously merits a great deal more of discussion. As the answers are displayed, the floor is once more opened up. If individuals are confused by why a certain answer is the correct one, they are allowed to voice their concerns at this point in time. And once again, a multi-directional flow of information is provided, where the students will justify their answers to the professor, and the professor will explain why the correct answer was the appropriate choice for the situation. Once a consensus is reached and everyone is satisfied with the correct answer, a new question is displayed and the process repeats again. This continues throughout the remainder of the class until either all the questions are answered or we have run out of time. Note once again, as mentioned earlier in this podcast, that it's not necessary to get through all of the available questions. These represent practice situations. All the relevant material is included in the podcast. This just gives students an opportunity to take that knowledge and apply it to clinical situations. I told you earlier on in the video that I was going to show you a way to be able to get a head start on the anatomy information prior to coming into class, and here it is. I'm actually in the process of taking all of the video podcasts and the PowerPoints and kinesthetic learning exercises that go along with them and uploading them to a specialized Google site that has been developed specifically for the anatomy classes I teach at the University of South Dakota. To be able to access it, you need to get to the Google main page and then click on the sign-in button. Now, I've got a couple of different sites here. One's a personal website I use. I've been teaching anatomy for a while, and prior to being at USD, the easiest way for students to be able to get in touch with me was through my Gmail account, and I decided to go with a very memorable name, so that's where Cadaver Man came from. This is the one that you're going to want. So what you will actually do is, for the first time visiting, you're going to have to click on Add an Account. And you're going to have to actually type in what you see here, usdanatomy@gmail.com. Now, it's already added for me, so I just have to click on it at this point in time. So that brings you to this screen where you see usdanatomy@gmail.com. If you want to take a minute and pause and copy this down, feel free to. Now you have to add in the password. The password for this site is anatomy, ANATOMY 123, and it's all lowercase letters and no spaces. So once again, ANATOMY 123, and click the sign in button. You're now into the USD Anatomy site, and you should see a little logo in the upper corner with the South Dakota emblem, and it's telling you that you're in USD Anatomy. Once you reach this screen, you need to click this 9-box emblem up here, which will pull up a submenu. What you're interested in at this point is the Drive button down at the bottom, so click on this. That loads you into the USD Anatomy site. It shows activity that's been going on, but specifically you're in the storage drive where information is allowed to be kept. What you're going to want to click on is Anatomy 511. That was the old call number that was used for the previous course on the old curriculum for medicine, and force of habit, I just keep using it. But this is the one that you want, Anatomy 511. And this goes for medical students as well as allied health students. When you click on it, you'll see a series of lectures. Currently, I've been working up to lecture 7. Depending on when you come back and actually witness this, you'll see additional lecture titles listed in all the way up to 12. So for example, I was earlier showing you some excerpts from lecture 2. So if I click on the lecture 2 folder, this is what should hopefully pop up. If it doesn't and you witness an error, just try and reload it or come back a little bit later. So these are all the files that are relevant to this specific lesson. We have the podcast itself, so this is the huge file that contains the actual audio information. We also have the PowerPoint presentation for the muscles of the back. We have the Adobe lesson for the muscles of the back. So this is the PDF document that goes along with the PowerPoint. If you're a Windows user, you're probably going to want to work with the PowerPoint. It's just a little bit more user-friendly. If you're a Mac user, you may not have PowerPoint loaded in, or you might have difficulty with the PowerPoint program. The PDF should work perfectly fine for you, so this is what you're going to be looking at. Bottom line, experiment around, find out what works best for your system, and if you're having problems with both or have suggestions and would like to ask and inquire if there's other programs that I can load into, I'll certainly take a look. I can't promise anything, but if I think there's a possibility, then I'll do it. With certain lectures, you'll also see these sorts of files called KLE files, in this case, lecture 2.1 and 2.2. So remember I was talking about the kinesthetic learning exercises, and I was showing you an example of this from earlier. So these are the image templates that contain the area of the skeleton that we use to draw the actual structures in. So if you think that you're going to want to participate in the kinesthetic learning exercises, and I strongly recommend at first that everyone at least give it a try, even if you don't think it sounds like something you might be interested in, you might surprise yourself and might find that it's much more helpful than you may have originally thought. So you can click on these and download them, print them off to paper if you prefer drawing on paper. For those of you that have touchpad technology, you might find it easier to actually save multiple copies and then just draw on them directly on your computer. I leave that up to you to determine what works best for you and your situation. So let's try clicking on the podcast itself. I'm getting a funky message saying that they cannot display the video right now. This is probably because it's still in the process of uploading. This is something I just very recently added. So clicking on it, you might see variable messages. It might actually play directly through the account, but if it encounters some errors, it might not. We do have a download button though, and this is really what you're going to be looking for, is to actually download the video. So we click on the download. You'll get the message that Google Drive can't scan this file for viruses. So in this case, you're going to have to trust me a little bit that I'm not trying to infect your computer and steal all your information. And click download anyway. This screen or something very similar to this screen should pop up, and it'll give you a couple of options. Either open with the VLC player. In this case, this is my default player. Really good media player, by the way, if you're Windows based, and they might have a Mac version as well. Or you can click on Save Files. So in this case, I'm going to click on the Save File. Let's just save it to my video libraries location, just for the heck of it here. So then I click Save. And it should actually be showing me some progress, and it looked like it actually, depending on your internet speed, this could take several minutes, depending on how fast it is. In this case, it seemed to have worked right away, so let's click on it and see what happens. And there you go. It ends up opening up in the podcast, and at this point, you should be able to scan through wherever you want, and once again, this picks up where we left off from. So at this stage, you now have this, if you follow these instructions, you now have the video saved to your hard drive or to flash drive or wherever you decide to put it. That's now available to you at all points in time. You don't even need internet access anymore. It's directly there for you. And as you go back to the Google website, so this takes us back into the Google website. You can jump around looking at the different lectures. And again, I'm just in the process of putting all these things together. So by the time you see this, hopefully all of these will be populated with additional lectures. But certainly over the next couple of weeks, you're going to be able to actually start looking into these lecture sessions. And if you have the time available and anatomy is something that you're feeling a little bit apprehensive about coming into the month of August, then this does give you the chance for a head start. It'll be a total of 12 videos, give or take roughly about an hour, depending on whether you do the kinesthetic learning exercises. Some of them do run long. They can go as long as an hour and 15 minutes in some cases. But this does give you a chance to get a head start on Unit 1 and look at the information that's going to be pertinent, so that for some of you, especially if you don't have an extensive background in anatomy, by day 1 of the course, when you're first coming in and sitting in for the facilitative active learning sessions, maybe you've already had a chance to watch all 12 of the podcasts from the first unit and have technically, therefore, covered all the material for Unit 1. It's the option that's available to you. It's certainly not mandatory because we will be going through it piece at a time, and you will probably find that as we approach each individual facilitative active learning session, you're probably going to want to rewatch the video podcast anyway the night before to make sure that you're up to scratch for the quiz the following day. But the option is there for you to get a head start if you so choose. The one thing that I would ask is, as you're navigating through this site, be very careful in making changes. I'm giving you full access to the site, which means as far as the Google site is concerned, it recognizes you as the owner and operator of the actual account. So consequently, if you're not careful, you could accidentally wipe out all the files onto the site. Not a big deal. I have them on a flash drive and on several locations on my computers, and I can certainly just upload them again. But it does create a bit of confusion if this happens and I'm not made aware of it for several days, and it deprives other individuals of being able to access the account. So download the material, but tread lightly, and if you do think you've accidentally made some changes to the website, send me an email, let me know about it, and I'll try and get back in and make the relevant corrections. So there you have it. That's what to expect from the flipped classroom design for Unit 1 of the Human Gross Anatomy class. Hopefully you're not too daunted by it and a little bit excited to try and implement it. I know that I'm excited to present it myself. It's been a fair bit of planning and a fair bit of work, and I'm optimistic that this is going to be an ideal approach to the study of anatomy. Again, though, as we're going through that unit, if you have some helpful suggestions or comments that you wish to make about the progress of it and how the flipped classroom design is being implemented, I'm certainly open to what you have to say. If necessary changes are recognized, it may not be possible to implement them this year, but it will help to hopefully make the entire process that much smoother in the following years to come. Including my email address one more time. If you have any questions about the flipped classroom design or anything else that you've seen in the 2 orientation videos that you've been sitting through, then please feel free to email me if you're having problems accessing the Google site or just not quite sure how to navigate your way around. Again, contact me. I'll do my best to help you with that. So until such time as I'm able to meet everyone in late July, early August, this has been Dr. Stuart Ingalls. Enjoy the rest of your summer.